Let's just bow our heads before we start. Our Father in heaven, thank you again for blessing us. Thank you for your word. And I pray, Lord, that as we open it again today, that you'll help us to understand the importance of Revelation chapter 10. I pray for Christ's sake. Amen. Good. So we're going to have a look at Pastor Marty. It sounds a little bit high or tinny or something. Testing one, yes, adjusted. All right, what we're going to study is still a bit echoing, is Revelation chapter 10, and it describes the experience of a mighty Christian. Now, you may remember some weeks ago we studied the 2,300 prophetic days or year period, and it brought us down to the year 1844. Started in 457, then the sanctuary will be cleansed. In other words, what we're going to study today is that God, in 1844, there are two things that happened. One on this earth and one in heaven. The one in heaven was the last judgment began. Today we're going to study the movement that God rose up on this earth in 1844. Because it's no good having a movement in heaven or a great work that Jesus is doing in heaven in the heavenly sanctuary if no one on earth knows anything about it. So at the same time that God had the last judgment to take place in heaven in the heavenly sanctuary, he raised up a message on this earth to tell people about it. So in 1844, the beginning of the heavenly judgment and the beginning of the final work of Christ in the heavenly sanctuary just before his return. That's what we're going to look at now. While Daniel 7 and 8 focus on what began in heaven in 1844, Revelation focuses on what began on earth in 1844. So can you see the twofold work? One in heaven and one on this earth. And today we're looking at what happened on the earth in 1844. All right, what kind of angel comes to earth? This is the first question. What kind of angel comes to earth with the message of Revelation chapter 10? What does it say? Mighty angel, that's right. Now, what would that suggest to you? If a mighty angel is coming, would that suggest to you that this message is important? Yes, I think so. So whatever it is, it's important. And describe the mighty one who gives this special message to John. Now, this is interesting because we're going to notice a parallel with Revelation 10, with Revelation chapter 1. First of all, he was clothed with a cloud. A rainbow was on his head. His face was like the sun. His feet like pillars of fire. Now, you can see that the description that's given here of Jesus, that each description, while we're not suggesting that there was an actual rainbow on his head, but what does the rainbow stand for? When God gave us the rainbow, what was that to illustrate? No more flood and mercy and grace. And so his face was like the sun gives us light. His feet like pillars of fire, meaning that there is also judgment with him. And this is the description. And maybe he looked something like this, as John was trying to describe him, you see. In Revelation 1, John describes another person he saw in vision. Note the characteristics of this description. This is why it's interesting. He was clothed with a garment down to his feet. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow. And his eyes like flames of fire, his feet like fine brass, as if refined in a furnace. So you can see the descriptions there that are very similar. And what we have in Revelation chapter 1 is describing Jesus. So obviously when we have a look at the same description or very similar wording of this mighty one in Revelation 10, it's showing us the parallel between the two descriptions or the two beings. All right, let's continue on. Who is the one that John is describing in Revelation 1:13? The Son of Man. It says that in the first chapter. Now, in Revelation 1 and Revelation 10, there is very similar wording. Very similar. And it's talking about Jesus. Even though in Revelation 10 he's described as a mighty angel, sometimes in the Bible Christ has taken the appearance of an angel. The word angel has a much broader meaning than simply limited to just what we might first of all understand as an angel. Sometimes Christ is referred to as an angel. That doesn't mean to say that he was a created being or anything like that. It's just using that description, that descriptive language. What does this mighty one have in his hand? According to Revelation 10, what is it? A little book open. Yes, that's interesting. The little book open in his hand indicates that it was at one time closed. The very fact that the Bible emphasizes that it's open indicates that probably it was shut at one time prior to that. Now, the question is, there is only one other book in the entire Bible that was said to be closed for a period of time. What book was that? Daniel. Remember, it was sealed up until the time of the end. It's the only book in the Bible that's ever been closed. Revelation, for example, is an open book because it's called a revelation or an unfolding. But Daniel was sealed up until the time of the end. And that helps to explain why the great reformers of the past, like Martin Luther and Wesley and these other great reformers, didn't understand much about Daniel. Because for that period it was closed, it was sealed up. And it only became understood at the time of the end, around about 1844. And it's interesting, if you do some study of history around at that time, that there were people all around the world who began to study the book of Daniel. Which is again fulfilling what the Bible said, that it would be sealed up until the time of the end. What book of the Bible was ever said to be closed? But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book. Yes, so it's the only book in the Bible that's ever been closed. Revelation 10, the little book opened in the time of the end that was once closed. Daniel chapter 12, the little book closed or sealed till the time of the end when opened knowledge will increase. And it's interesting that in 1844, if you go back to history and go back and Google 1844, you will find some of the amazing discoveries all took place in the year 1844. Some of the discoveries were not particularly positive. For example, this is when Charles Darwin wrote the first sketch of his Origin of Species in 1844. There were just so many interesting things that were discovered in 1844. The movement described in Revelation 10 has to do with the unsealing of the book of Daniel. Because if Revelation 10 is not dealing with its unsealing, there's no other section in the Bible that deals with the unsealing of Daniel. How long was the book of Daniel to remain sealed? To the time of the end. All right, you've been through that. The time of the end, when did it begin? According to Daniel 12, 1-9, it says, "At that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time." So Michael is going to stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And that's when there was going to be a time of trouble. And at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So this is dealing with this period of the time of the end. But you, Daniel, shut up the words, seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. In other words, there was going to be a tremendous explosion in knowledge. And that's another indication. Once again, if you Google 1844 and the discoveries that took place in that period, you'll be amazed at the increase of knowledge that started in that very year. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood two others, one on this riverbank and the other on that riverbank. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? In other words, Daniel was concerned, and the angels were saying, how long is it going to be until all of these wonders that have been described in Daniel, when are they going to be fulfilled? Then I heard the man clothed in linen, that's Christ, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. Now, we have done a study in our earlier studies of Daniel, because this period called a time, times, and half a time is mentioned 7 times in the books of Daniel and Revelation. It's called the 1260 year period. How do we arrive at that? Well, in the Bible, a time represents a year. And in the Bible, year is 360 days in a Bible year. It was a halfway between the lunar year and the solar year, and they came to 360. So 360 for a time, times is double that, which is 720, and half a time is half 360, and if you add those three together, it comes to 1,260 days or years. And as I said, it's mentioned 7 times in the books of Daniel and Revelation, which again indicates that this is important, because 7 is the perfect number in the Bible. Although I heard, I did not understand. So did Daniel understand what he was writing? No, it says I heard it and I wrote it down, but I didn't understand what I was writing. Then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. So did Daniel ever understand these things? No, he didn't. Because the angel, Christ, said to him, look, this is not going to be unsealed until the time of the end. And so the time of the end, when did it begin? After the time, times, and half a time. Or the 1260 year period, which began in 538, went down to 1798 when the Pope was taken prisoner by Napoleon's General Berthier, and everyone living at that time thought the papacy was finished. But the Bible said no, it would receive a deadly wound, but it would recover. And today we are living in the age of the recovery of the papacy. And if ever there's a time of recovery, it's today, as the Pope has the command of the world at its feet. And it's significant that all of this trouble with the environment and so forth, the Catholic Church is leading out, saying what we need to do is have a rest day every week, and so forth. So I believe that as we see things transforming and transforming before our eyes, that the papacy is going to rise more and more into prominence and fulfill what Revelation has said, that all the world is going to wonder after the beast. And we're living in that very momentous time. According to Daniel 12, the time of the end began after the 1260-year period, or in 1798. At that time, Daniel would be unsealed, and the final events that led to the return of Christ would begin to unfold. And as I said, it's all around this time that Daniel was studied. This is the time when Sir Isaac Newton began to study Daniel and wrote his commentary on the book of Daniel. So the second identification point is that the movement of Revelation 10 must arise at the time of the end. In other words, around about 1798, in that period. This is the period that opens with the 19th century down to our day. What is the angel, where is the angel standing? He set his right foot on the sea and left foot on the earth. So you can imagine he's straddling the sea and the land. What do you think that's indicating? The angel is straddling the water and the land. What's that indicating, do you think? Yes, the whole world. He's in command of the whole world. And in other words, this message is going to go to the whole world, not just the earth. Identification point number 3. The movement would be worldwide. What was John told to do with the revelation of the 7 thunders? He was to seal up the things which the 7 thunders uttered. Unfortunately, the Bible doesn't tell us what those 7 thunders were. So we are not going to speculate this afternoon as to what they were, but once again, there are some things that we won't understand until the fulfillment of them, and this is one of them, the 7 thunders. There was something hidden from the movement of Revelation chapter 10. What does the angel proclaim about time? That there should be delay or time no longer. Yes. In other words, time would no longer keep going like it has been going. And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, according to Revelation 10, and swear by him that liveth for ever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer. Revelation 10. The book of Daniel is unique in that it introduces 2 time prophecies that reach to the time of the end. After these time prophecies have been fulfilled, we are in the time of the end, when the prophetic time has run out and the end of time fast approaches. In other words, this is going to bring us down to the end of prophetic time. And then we're on, from that point onwards, we are living on borrowed time until Jesus returns. And how much like a rubber band, how long that period now is going to stretch until Jesus comes, I don't know. Neither does anyone else. But it must be coming to an end soon. And I think what we're seeing out when you go outside this church and look at the sky, you'll understand that we're living in a period when momentous things are beginning to happen on the earth. And I believe that these fires are just a beginning of what's going to happen before Jesus returns. If you read Revelation chapter 16 and the 7 plagues and some of them, the things associated with that, you will see a great parallel between what we are reading here and what the Bible says is happening. So, once again, just to remind ourselves of this time period from 538 to 1798, and that's when the time of the end would begin, when the papacy was wounded. The Pope was taken into prisoner, and he died the following year, and there was no papacy, no Pope, for a number of years. And as I said, everyone thought the papacy was finished. But the Bible taught otherwise. So Daniel 12:7, sealed until the time of the end, which begins at the end of the 1260 years. And I'm taking for granted that we remember some of the studies that we've done in the past. For the 2,300 days, then will the sanctuary be cleansed, which brings us down to the year 1844, when Jesus enters the most holy place as our high priest in the heavenly sanctuary. And on this earth began a message, a movement. Daniel 8:17 and 26, it says, we're sealed until the time of the end, 1798, after which the 2,300-year time prophecy would begin to be understood. Prior to that, it wouldn't be understood. What portion of the book of Daniel was specifically sealed and closed until the time of the end? So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, Son of Man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. So are we suggesting, or is the Bible suggesting, that the story of Daniel and the lion's den was not understood prior to 1844? No, nor Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, nor those early chapters in Daniel. They've always been understood by Christians down through the years. But it's the prophetic part of Daniel that has not been understood until 1844. That's why Daniel 8 is saying, understand, Son of Man, that the vision that you've just seen of the 2,300 days in the ram and the he-goat refers to the time of the end. That's the period that was locked up. And the vision of the 2,300 evenings and mornings, which was told is true, therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days or years into the future. Many, many years. Daniel 8:26. So identification point number 5 is the movement of Revelation 10 must arise around 1844, somewhere in that vicinity. What will be finished under the preaching of the movement? According to Revelation 10, the mystery of God. You know, the Bible talks about two major mysteries. There's the mystery of iniquity and the mystery of godliness. When the Bible talks of a mystery, it's not saying it's mysterious. It's saying that unless revelation, unless inspiration revealed it to us, we would never, ever have worked it out. For example, how sin arose, unless God revealed that to us, there wouldn't be a single human being that's ever lived on the earth that could have worked that out. But because God revealed it to us, he's called it the mystery of iniquity. Now, the same is true of salvation. Unless God revealed the story of Jesus being born as a babe and dying on the cross, we would never, ever have worked that out. No human being could have ever worked that out. It's a mystery. And that's why there are two mysteries in the Bible, the mystery of iniquity and the mystery of godliness. And here, what will be finished under the preaching of the movement, the mystery of God, meaning the mystery of salvation, is going to be finished. It's going to come to an end. And for me, that utterance may be given to me that I may open my mouth boldly to make known the mystery of the gospel. According to Ephesians, Paul is writing there, the mystery of the gospel. As I said, it would be no human being could have ever worked that out. It's a mystery. Now to him who is able to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery kept secret since the world began. So, once again, this is the mystery of godliness, the mystery of salvation that was kept secret since the world began. The finishing of the mystery of God is the completion of the work of the gospel upon earth. And, all right, identification point number 6. The movement of Revelation 10 gives the final warning message that prepares the world for the second coming of Christ. It proclaims the end-time gospel message. Now, there's another reason why God doesn't have an event in this earth, but he warns about it. You can't imagine a flood without a Noah. You can't imagine the coming of Jesus without John the Baptist. And so before Jesus comes back the second time, God has a special message which goes out to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people to get people ready for the coming of Jesus. And this is the proclamation of that end-time gospel message. What was John to do with the little book? And how would it taste in his mouth? And how would his stomach feel? It was to eat it. In his mouth it will be sweet as honey. It made his stomach bitter. In other words, when John ate this book, what does it mean to eat a book? Do we literally eat a book? No. Yes. We talk about devouring a book. Now, if you said to me, I simply devoured that book, would I understand you to mean that you actually literally ate it? No, I would understand exactly what you meant. You read it and you loved it, and you just, yeah, that's right, buried yourself in it. That's a good expression. And this is what this is referring to when it says he was to eat it, meaning he was to devour it. And his mouth, when he first ate it, it would be sweet, but it would turn bitter. All right, what does that have? What's the meaning of that? A bittersweet experience. Now when I looked, there was a hand stretched out to me, and behold, a scroll of a book was in it. Then he spread it before me, and there was writing on the inside and on the outside, and written on it were lamentations and mourning and woe. So here's an Old Testament illustration of a very similar experience of positive things and negative things. You shall speak my words to them, whether they hear or whether they refuse, for they are rebellious. But you, son of man, hear what I say to you. Do not be rebellious like that rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. So there are many illustrations in the Bible of this very thing. And there's one from the book of Ezekiel. So this terminology is not new. It was used in the Bible. Moreover, he said to me, Son of man, eat what you find, eat this scroll, and go speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he caused me to eat that scroll. Once again, God is saying here that this man is to give out the message. And he said to me, Son of man, feed your belly and fill your stomach with this scroll that I give you. So I ate, and it was in my mouth like honey in sweetness. Can you see where John is quoting from? This is the whole point about Revelation. You will never understand Revelation if you don't understand the Old Testament, because most of the imagery of Revelation actually comes from the Old Testament, and this is a perfect illustration. Then he said to me, Son of man, go to the house of Israel and speak with my words to them. So this idea of eating a book and then going forth and speaking it to the people is what the illustration is all about. And so in these last days, God is picking up exactly the same terminology in Revelation when he was told to eat this book that was sealed up, eat it. And it would make you feel sweet at first, but it would eventually turn bitter, and we'll explain why it turned bitter in a few moments. Your words were found, and I ate them, and your word was to me the joy and rejoicing of my heart. For I am called by your name, O Lord God of hosts. Identification point number 7. The understanding of Daniel would be a pleasant, happy experience, but it would end in bitter disappointment. So that's the terminology that's used there in Revelation 10. Now, as the people began to study the book of Daniel, it was a very, very wonderful experience, because what did they first begin to arrive? What was the conclusion that they arrived at when they began to study Revelation and Daniel? By the way, there were no Seventh-day Adventists in existence at this particular time, but what did these Christians, led by William Miller, a Baptist? Yes, they predicted that Christ was going to come back on October 22, 1844. As I said, the Seventh-day Adventists have never set a date for the coming of Jesus. The people who have set a date were the Baptists and the Catholics and the Methodists and the Congregational and so forth. These were the folk who set the date for the coming of Jesus. And Anglicans, yeah. But they began to study, and you can imagine, if you believe that Christ was coming in a date very close to where you were living, for example, if you were convinced from the study of the Bible that Christ was coming back in the year 2020, do you think that would be a happy experience? I think so. We'd all be very happy about that, wouldn't we? If we were convinced that it was right? And these people were convinced that Christ was coming in 1844. So it was very sweet. Joseph Wolfe preached in the Middle East and North Africa and England and India. Went through all of those places. Catholic priest Manuel Akansa, Ben Ezra, the coming of the Messiah in South America, he began to preach. He wrote this book, The Coming of the Messiah. Edward Irving in Britain, Thomas Playford in Adelaide. Ever heard of Thomas Playford? He was a premier. And there was a man by the name of Thomas Playford who became, but this is going back earlier. They were all teaching that Jesus was coming in 1844. Go tell it to the world. William Miller, who was born in 1782 in the United States of America. As I said, William Miller was a Baptist layman, and he led out in this movement. By the way, with your lesson, you've got that, is it a pink handout? Or green, is it? Blue. If you would like to read that, you'll find some very interesting information in that regarding this bitter-sweet experience. So I'd like to encourage you to read it. As I said, you'll be tremendously blessed by it. The Millerites and many others believed Jesus would come at the end of the 2,300 years, or on October 22, 1844. Sister. No, all the others believed it. But he based it on his understanding of the 2,300 year period. But it wasn't just William Miller. There were thousands and thousands of people who believed this. And you can understand the bitter experience that happened when Jesus didn't come in 18. The great disappointment, that's right. It was terrible. And they were believing that Christ was going to come back. They sold their businesses. What money they had, they put into printing tracts and helping other people to understand it. So you can just understand how devastated they were when Christ didn't return. Language cannot, this is James White, language cannot describe the solemnity of that hour. The time for shouting and display of talent in speaking, singing and praying seemed to be past. The brethren and sisters calmly consecrated themselves and their all to the Lord and his cause, and with humble prayers and tears sought his pardon and favour. Because as that date, October 22, was coming closer and closer, they searched their hearts. They wanted to be ready for the coming of Jesus. They didn't want to miss out. And this was the happiest year of my life. My heart was full of glad expectation. That's what Ellen White, or her name was Ellen Harmon in those days.
So she was part of it.
Yes. But remember, what religion was she? She was Methodist at this particular time. The great disappointment, let's go back, wait a moment. The great disappointment of October 23, 1844, that is, the day after October 22. Bitter disappointment. Christ hadn't come back. They waited until midnight thinking, well, Jesus told the parable of the bridegroom coming at midnight. So they said, it's going to be at midnight. So they waited until midnight, and midnight came and passed, and Jesus did not come back, and the disappointment of the following day took place. In fact, Hiram Edson wrote, one of the believers at that time, said, "We look for our coming Lord until the clock told 12 at midnight. The day had then passed, and our disappointment became a certainty. Our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted, and such a spirit of weeping came over us as I have never experienced before. We wept and wept till the day dawned." Can you imagine the poor people who were devastated by this? After the bitter disappointment of the book of Daniel, what was the movement of Revelation 10 to do? You must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. So the Bible says you're to go back after the disappointment, go back and you're to prophesy again. And before nations, tongues, and kings. So identification point number 8, they were to arise and go into all the world again with the message of the book of Daniel. They were not to be put off by their disappointment, but they were to go ahead. And this is when the Advent believers, and they began to study more. As we review the 8 marks of the identification of Revelation 10 has given us, describing this movement, number 1 said it has to do with the unsealing of the book of Daniel. That's what we found earlier. Second, it arises at the time of the end. It would be a worldwide movement. There is something hidden from the movement of Revelation 10 as described in the 7 thunders. What do we think that which was hidden has to do with? What was hidden about the disappointment? Yes. And just as well I didn't understand. I've often thought it's probably a very good thing that we don't know when we're going to die. Is that right? If you knew that you were going to die this time next year, do you think you'd have a very happy year? Or this time next week? Do you think the week would be very happy? No, you wouldn't be able to think about anything except I'm going to die. I've got 16 hours left, 15, 14. And so God keeps from us some things that would not be helpful to us for us to know. And God kept the disappointment from them, as illustrated by the story of the 7 thunders. The 5th point we noticed, it must arise at the end of the prophetic time periods, that is around 1844. It gives the final warning message that prepares the world for the second coming of Christ, finishing the mystery of God. That was the 6th point. The 7th point we noticed, the understanding of Daniel would be a pleasant and happy experience, but it would end in a bitter disappointment. And the 8th, it was to go forth with renewed zeal after the disappointment and present to all the world the message of the book of Daniel. So there were the 8 points that we've gone through that are all in your lesson, by the way. So you don't have to memorize them now. They're there all for you. Did such a movement as described in Revelation 10 arise and fulfill these 8 marks of identification? Did it? Yes. Well, let's have a look. The Seventh-day Adventist movement. The Seventh-day Adventists arose out of the disappointment. As I said, Seventh-day Adventists have never, ever set a date for the coming of Jesus. It's the Sunday-keeping churches that set a date, and it explains to us why these churches have gone quiet on the second coming of Christ. because they were wrong back there. And so, we often say, once bitten, twice shy. That's right. And so instead of venturing into any more talk, they just don't talk about it at all. And those of us who have been brought up in these churches will admit that we've hardly ever heard a sermon on the second coming of Christ. And that's the reason, because their fingers were burnt back in 1844. And those that stayed on decided that they'd never venture into those things. And Daniel and Revelation are not books that we're to study. And if you meet any of these people, and there are good people in those churches, let me tell you, but if you meet them, they will admit to you that, no, we never studied. I don't think I've ever heard a sermon on Daniel and Revelation, especially in the prophecies. And this is the reason we want you to read this exhibit that we gave you, this blue exhibit, on the movement of Revelation 10. You will just find such interesting material when you read that through, about how they felt and the experiences that they went through. It'll be quite a revelation to you. Over the centuries, the second coming of Jesus Christ became a forgotten doctrine of the Bible. However, in the 1780s to 1840s, there was a renewed interest in the second coming of Christ based on the 2300-day prophecy of Daniel 8 and 9. This became a worldwide movement in England, Scandinavia, and the United States of America. The leader of the movement in the United States was Mr. William Miller, a Baptist farmer. And Miller believed that at the end of the 2300 years, the sanctuary, meaning the earth, would be cleansed, meaning by fire. So you can see where he made his mistake. He thought that the cleansing of the sanctuary was the cleansing of this earth. And that would be when Jesus came back to destroy the earth with fire. Get his reasoning? Yes. And that's where he made his mistake. Many different people believed that Christ would come in their lifetime at the end of the 2300 days, which was 1844. Miller was convicted in 1831 that he should publicly preach the second coming. And we've got to remember this, that William Miller was not someone who was a natural preacher. He found words hard to put together, and he was very, very reticent. And it wasn't until he asked God for a sign, and God gave him a distinct sign that indicated that he was to go out and preach what he had found. He preached all over the United States to many different faiths, and a phenomenal revival broke out, and lots of people accepted Jesus Christ as a result of his work. And there he is preaching, a picture of him preaching, and there's the people listening to him. And interesting for those of you who have got hearing aids, see this fellow down here? They didn't have hearing aids, of course, back in those days. They had these sort of big megaphones that they would put up to their ear. And it's just interesting, isn't it? And this was one of his charts that he had drawn up, the end of the world in 1843, because originally he believed it was going to be in 1843. Then they restudied it and found it was 1844. And when he didn't come in 1844, that's when the bit of disappointment. And you can see here on this right-hand side that he had the same teaching that we have. 538, the dates and so forth for the rise of these animals and so forth. So it's very interesting to find this material. It's still available today. This is the newspaper articles that made fun of them. You can see here the grand ascension of the Miller Tabernacle. You know, the cartoonists?
Is this after the event?
Yes. No, after the event.
That would have been horrible.
Yes, Miller in his glory, saints and sinners in one great conglomeration. Yes. It would have been terrible. You can imagine living at that time, and now they're making fun of you. And so many people left Christianity. They left belief in God. They were so devastated. It was all over for them. They never went back to church, never prayed, never believed in God from that point onwards. But others believed that the Bible was not wrong. It was their misunderstanding, and they went back to study. And as a result, that's where the Seventh-day Adventist Church arose. When the stars fell on November 12 or 13, 1833, many then accepted Miller's preaching, because Miller had been preaching that there were going to be signs that would be taking place just before Jesus returned. And so when the stars fell, or big meteorite showers took place, people felt the judgment of God was on the place. And that caused them again to repent. Get the idea? Miller preached a premillennial appearing of Jesus Christ. What does the word premillennial mean? Better make sure we all understand this term. Yes, that Christ would come back before the millennium, or the 1,000 years. The word millennium means 1,000 years. So Miller taught, like we teach, that Christ is going to return before the 1,000 years begin. Right? So that's what it means. Miller preached a premillennial appearance of Jesus Christ instead of the traditional post-millennial teaching, because all the Christian churches basically were teaching that the world was going to get better and better and better and better and better, and then Christ would come when the world was really good. Get the idea? Now, Miller taught the very opposite to that. He said, no, Christ is going to come back before the 1,000 years start. The message spread like wildfire around the world. Loughborough was one of the early Adventists, and he wrote that in his book. When some Protestant churches rejected the second coming doctrine, the Millerite movement brought the world's biggest tent and carted it around the United States, preaching the message of the soon return of Jesus. That's why, if we go back here, the cartoonist had this looking like a tent, see? So that was the whole, because they had the biggest tent that the world knew at that time to fit the people in. Thousands and thousands were coming out to listen to the preaching. Yes. So they carted it around the United States, preaching the message of the soon return of Jesus. This movement was very biblically based, and you'll see that in one of your that exhibit that we're giving you. When Jesus had not returned by March 21, 1843, the Jewish year, they restudied to get the exact month and day right. They found it was the 10th day of the 7th month, which was the equivalent to October 22, 1844. And here they are studying. And that's one thing it's a wonderful thing about our early pioneers. They studied the Bible to work out every one of the doctrines that we hold today, were all studied clearly from the Bible. And they prayed. There's Ellen Harmon and James White and others in that early movement. During this time, another 50,000 members left their churches to join the Millerite movement. But at midnight on October 22, 1844, they realized that the sweet message of the soon return of Jesus Christ had turned into a bitter disappointment. Some left the group, and two groups then formed from the original Millerites. There were Advent Christians and Seventh-day Adventists. And by the way, out of this movement, that's when Herbert Armstrong and so forth arose. And so forth. And he had some very skew-with ideas that are still perpetrated today by a small group, but that's where it all came from. And they all arose about the same time, and Seventh-day Adventists are the largest because they're in every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. Every other group almost faded away as Armstrong is today. Just a few thousand are left because they've had, They've had wars within their own movement. And Seventh-day Adventists have never set a date for the second coming of Christ. In fact, Ellen White warned against date setting, reminding the early Seventh-day Adventist church that Jesus had said that no man knows the day nor the hour of his return. However, a small group of believers had faith that still God would lead them. And Hiram Edson's group of believers found out that the sanctuary was in heaven and that 1844 marked not the end of the world, but merely the final phase of the judgment in heaven. And the true meaning of 1844, the judgment, not the second coming of Christ. In other words, when the sanctuary was to be cleansed, they finally understood that not to be the end of the world, but the last work that Jesus was going to do in heaven and the heavenly sanctuary, and at the same time a movement will arise on this earth to go to every nation, kindred, tongue and people. Through extra Bible study and prayer, this group accepted the sanctuary, the Sabbath, the second coming, and the spirit of prophecy as being foundational biblical truths that had been lost during the Dark Ages. See, in 1844 they were disappointed. In 1848 they called what is known today as the Sabbath conferences. Now, it was people from all these different churches all came together and they studied the Sabbath conferences. And that's when they came to the conclusion of, they understood the sanctuary over this period. They came to a conviction over the Sabbath, the second coming, and the spirit of prophecy. And that was how Seventh-day Adventists came into existence, as a result of the conferences of 1848, 4 years after 1844. By studying Revelation 10 verse 11, early Seventh-day Adventists realized they had a worldwide mission to warn the world to prepare for the future coming of Christ. So in 1863, the Seventh-day Adventist Church was born to raise up people to be ready for the judgment and the second coming of Jesus Christ. In 1863, Seventh-day Adventist Church was organized. How far and wide is God's last day message to be preached to every nation, tribe, tongue and people? That's why I say to these folk, and not when I meet them from time to time, whether it's Herbert Armstrong or whether it's Jehovah's Witnesses or whoever it is, they are not in every nation, kindred, tongue and people. So the Lord will never come if we're going to rely upon those people, because they're not even in every nation, kindred, tongue and people. Step outside the British countries and they've never heard of Herbert Armstrong. Never. Whereas God has a message which is to go to every nation, kindred, tongue and people. And Seventh-day Adventists are the most widely, apart from the Catholic Church, Seventh-day Adventists are the most widely disseminated church in this world. No other is equal seven. We have the largest Protestant schooling system. We have the largest hospital system in the world. And no other church comes anywhere near us, because this message has been raised up by God. That's why God is in the movement. And as we partner together. Oh, by the way, this is interesting. Just as proof, this is put out by the American Bible Society and Church Missions. And see the little dot? You probably can't read from where you're sitting. There's small writing here. But these are all the countries down to the left. And the dots represent those churches that are listed here, where they are in the world. Get the idea? And you might like to have a closer look at this, but I want to show you Seventh-day Adventists in a moment, I think. Here we are. This one. This is Seventh-day Adventists. Look, let's just go back again. Adventist, seventh day. Can you read that? That's the second column. Look at this. All the way down here. And you compare that with any of the other churches. And they've got dots here and there. And you continue over the page. And look, Down we go again. There's hardly a spot where Seventh-day Adventists aren't. And that's not put out by us. That's put out by the Bible Society. Because Adventists are the most widely spread church in the world. And Seventh-day Adventist World Church, we have 13 divisions. The colours here all represent the divisions of the world where the world has been divided up. And for example, yellow is what we call the South Pacific. And there are 13 divisions in the world. And so we are concentrating on the whole world as our parish. And no other church can come anywhere near that. As of December 31, 2015, there were 81,500 churches or companies, 69,909 membership, or companies, 69,000. Membership at that stage was over 19 million. We're working in 1,260,880 languages used, 974 schools, 7,792 hospitals and so on. And schools, sorry, I got that wrong. Let's just go back to that again. There are schools, 7,792, and hospitals, 175. Sessions mean folk who come into the church but not through baptism but by profession of faith, who have been baptized the correct way, but maybe they're Baptists who become Adventists. Now that number today is well up into the mid-20s. I just can't give you the exact figure as to what it is right now, but that's a few years ago, isn't it? 4 years ago. Yes, so interesting. What special message does the Church of the Last Days proclaim? The hour of his judgment has come. Yes. That's 17. And then Jesus declares that he is the good shepherd and knows his sheep. What has Christ done for his sheep? I lay down my life for the sheep, Jesus said. And it's interesting, he says, are all of God's sheep in Christ's fold now? Are they? No. Other sheep I have which are not of this fold. So what does that mean that we have a responsibility to do? Our responsibility is evangelism. And to try to find these other sheep which are not of the fold yet, but when they've given an invitation and shown, will accept the message. And what is to happen to Christ's sheep who are not in this fold at the present time? Them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one fold and one shepherd. So is it God's intention that all these churches exist? No, God only has one fold. And it's his intention to bring everybody into that one fold. And the Bible uses the illustration of the shepherd and the sheep. What will those who do truly love Jesus, what will those do who truly love Jesus? If you love me, keep my commandments. Yes, we know that verse well. How does the Bible describe the remnant who are of the one fold? They keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Remember, we discussed this last week. And they're the two characteristics of God's last people. They are faithful to Jesus and faithful to his commandments. How does John describe those who proclaim the three angels' messages? Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Yes. I'm sorry these are not quite in there, but you can see it. What final call does God give to his people who are in Babylon? Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins and lest you receive of her plagues. In other words, God is calling his people out of Babylon to accept his truth for these last days. Because you can't be saved in Babylon. Babylon is lost. The appeal of Christ to come out of her, my people. So that again illustrates that many of God's people are now in Babylon. And our message is to call them out of Babylon. And our last point is that your desire to come out of Babylon and become a part of God's final movement, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and help proclaim this message into all the world. Well, I certainly hope it is. It's my desire. All right, well, let's have a look at our quiz. See if we're on the ball. The mighty messenger of Revelation 10 is none other than Jesus Christ himself. Remember, we were comparing the two pictures of the heavenly being. All right, the mighty messenger. So what did you get down for that? True? The second question is, the movement of Revelation 10 deals with the unsealing of the book of Revelation. Be careful. Read the question carefully. The movement of Revelation 10 deals with the unsealing of the book of Revelation. True or false? False. It's the unsealing of what book? Daniel, yes. Just a trick question. The movement described in Revelation 10 is to arise around 1844 and preach the beginning of the judgment. True or false? True. All right, the Seventh-day Adventist Church arose in the aftermath of the Great Advent Awakening of the mid-19th century. However, Seventh-day Adventists have never predicted a date for the coming of the Lord to come. True. And our final question, God has believers in all churches and asks them to stay there even when they learn that the truth is taught by the remnant church. True or false? False. Because God expects them to come out of Babylon and to leave the churches that they belong to. And sometimes that is what causes people to stumble, because they don't want to step out into something new that they haven't done in their life before. So there we have the message. So I hope that you've got all your lessons to 32, have you? Bow our heads in prayer. Our Father in heaven, I just want to thank you again today for the message of God. I thank you, Lord, for the book of Daniel and Revelation that so clearly outlined to us this last message. And I pray, Lord, that you'll help us all to be faithful to that message, because that message is your message. It was given by Jesus himself in his own book. And so I pray, Lord, that you'll give us travelling mercies as we go home, bring us back again next Sabbath afternoon. I pray for Christ's sake. Amen.